I've been making it clear, if you've been following recent developments on the channel, that I've been bringing my thoughts on weekly anime more into the mix on here, having gone back into it fully this past year. And with that has been one anime this season by all accounts has more or less felt similar in its premise. Its name is Hana-Kimi. Anime by Signal MD, who have previously worked on such anime such as Platinum End and Dragon Girls House Hunting in the past, is an adaptation of a Shojo manga which has started all the way back in the late 90s. While its source material is about 30 years old as of this anime's airing this year, I can safely say that by the way it's presented is still just as timeless as ever, despite the fact it's had a few adaptations in other mediums before this. But the main thing that really drew me in as being interested in this series most of all was the premise of it being a female student masquerading as a boy in order to enter an all-boys high school to get close to an athletics hero of hers that has gone dormant due to an injury. The series, as you expect, juggles the expectations of what would come from this kind of premise. The secrecy of our protagonist who keeps up the act of being masculine despite her body betraying her, the intrigue of why men around her are feeling the way they do, and in one instance playing with the premise with one or two characters questioning their own sexuality as a result of this. That last bit of which is something that struck me as a surprise, given when this series was originally being written at the tail end of the 90s. You would expect it to be played up more for laughs, which, while it certainly does from time to time, there's a tinge of seriousness within the series' depiction of such topics, especially given that the fact at times, while many people would essentially write off what the series displays as queerbaiting, I'd argue that for the time of its original release, one could say that Hana-Kimi in its manga format was arguably ahead of the curve, and the fact we're getting a full-blown anime adaptation in 2026, some 20 years after the manga's finished, is a testament to its staying power. But admittedly, while I was thinking about all of that when watching the show itself, there was one thing that kept creeping in the back of my mind the entire time, was a simple statement. Okay, close enough. Welcome back, Ouran High School Host Club.
Kiss, kiss, fall in love.
And look, I get it's wrong to make that statement regarding Hana-Kimi because technically that one came first prior to Ouran and even ended right before Ouran began being published. But like, let's be real here. When you think of a genderfucky story with a girl going to an all-boys school and having to keep up the act for everyone's sake, Ouran High School Host Club is the first series that will pop into your head immediately. And if you say otherwise, you're probably either lying to yourself, or you've spent way too much time binging series in your lifetime like me. Either way you put it, Ouran is without a doubt the absolute first series that many will think of with this premise, and for good reason. Its anime adaptation in 2006 is still considered by many to be one of the biggest gateway animes, not just of my generation, but for the generations that came after me watching anime either on TV, online, or through streaming.
In fact, I'd argue that if your cutoff point for getting into anime was before 2018, it's probably been recommended to you once or twice by many people in your circle of watching it, and for good reason, as it follows along the same premise that Hana-Kimi followed, with our main protagonist Haruhi Fujioka fighting her way into an all-boys school, the titular Ouran High School, breaking a vase in the namesake host club, working off the debt of breaking the vase in the host club throughout the course of the series. Of course, with a premise like this, shenanigans around with both members of the host club itself as well as the dynamics of those who are adjacent to it, and in Haruhi's personal life as a result. Leading to there being a lot of hijinks which were equally as entertaining for the time as they were absolutely cause for being an easy way for newcomers to get themselves invested in shoujo. However, if Hana-Kimi is anything to go by with its more modernized adaptation, despite its humor being of the time, many have made the argument that Ouran is suddenly problematic for anime audiences of today, in particular queer audiences.
And as an out and about trans woman for nearly a good 6 years now, who grew up with this as one of my formative anime experiences, I have a few goddamn opinions to make regarding this 20-year-old anime series with that alone, as well as a few of my own takes on what is happening with the cultural zeitgeist surrounding Ouran being seen today, for better and for worse. So, if you don't know me, I'm Chloe, and this is my look at the complicated queerness of Ouran High School Host Club. So let's nip this idea in the bud real quick, because I've seen a lot of takes in the past decade which have left me a bit bewildered. But granted, that is due to the changing of the times and our expectations of what we consider good representation versus what is considered problematic representation of certain topics. I made this clear when I worked with Hunter on the Pride Month anime video with him regarding Ouran, which, trust me, we will get to that in a moment. But I want to answer this question here and now. Is Ouran problematic? Straight up, by today's standards, yes, it could be argued that it is the case. But it's only because our tastes have changed so much that we consider something like the overtly flamboyant nature of characters like Tamaki Suo and even Ryuji Fujioka, who we will be covering separately to make it clear for reasons that are obvious. But when the series was first being released, not just in its anime format, but in its original source material in 2004, it was arguable that alongside Hana-Kimi wrapping up, it was filling a void of a level of digestible queerness that was solely needed for its time under the guise of more comedic shoujo antics to fly under the radar as to not attract the ire of more mainstream audiences.
This isn't to deny the main point of what people bring about when discussing these topics in the way that the characters in general are portrayed. It's one of the bigger bulks of the argument. Some parts are uncomfortable to sit through even with the context of being a literal 20-year-old story by now, such as Kyoryu literally sexually assaulting Haruhi in Ouran. But to say that it deserves to be written off entirely off the back of those more problematic elements, or even outright told to be avoided entirely for its collective issues, is to ignore history itself. And let me tell you, regardless of how you feel regarding history, we cannot do anything but learn from it at the end of the day. With that said, no. I do not consider Ouran to be a problematic piece of work because at the time it came out back in the mid-2000s, we very much did not know the same sensibilities that we have today regarding the topics that it covers, the queerness involved in it, and how it represents certain characters. Does it mean it doesn't have issues? Jesus Christ, no. And we'll talk about those in a good minute, don't you worry. But I needed to preface all of that off the bat because when you try and search up anything relating to Ouran to queerness online, there's a plentiful amount of debating and prognosticating about how the issues we're gonna talk about make it one to avoid rather than form an individual opinion on. It makes it complicated to indulge in for sure, but I would argue most series of its nature are complicated and, like Hana-Kimi's recent airing has shown, still has a place if you give it a more modernized, nuanced spin of it. Something in which we could argue Ouran does in fact need more than ever.
But for what we have in front of us, let's talk about the series for what's and all and dive deeper into what exactly has people so up in arms about today. One of the biggest grievances happens pretty early on when, in episode 8 of the anime, Haruhi is straight up pushed by Kyoryu and told, hey, I could effectively molest you at any time because I'm a man and you're a woman. Which, even by the standards back then, weren't so great as a comment. But a lot of people seem to misplace a lot of the context that came from that particular scene and take it squarely out of context. Which a lot of these arguments seem to plainly ignore to make the point that sexual assault isn't okay and therefore this show is not okay to watch, without putting their critical thinking caps on for one goddamn second.
See, in the context of the part of the story it takes place in, that of the prerequisite beach episode of any anime of its time, and hell, even today somewhat, while it does focus on the typical archetypes regarding fan service bits, it does shine a bit of a light on the topic that the entire focus should really be on scenes like this in Ouran, its presenting of gender roles, and how Haruhi doesn't exactly fit in even camp for one reason or another. And with the boys of the cast immediately going off to figure out what her weakness is in order to try and find a way to beat her properly regarding her beating them, as the heroic male archetype is being joked about by Tamaki early on, it turns into an exercise to finally find the one thing about her that they can use to their advantage. Eventually leading to Haruhi besting them at everything they throw against her, much to their frustration. The true brunt of the arc's character dive, and the focus of this particular section of it entirely, comes from a moment where Haruhi is specifically blindsided by some thugs after assisting some girls near a cliff. This falls into a moment where, following Tamaki coming down to get her after she's endangered, they end up having a tiff with Haruhi over putting herself in harm's way because of her still being a woman, and her side of gender ideals conflicting on that. Hence, when she still attempts to one-up Tamaki in the later part of the evening, it causes her, following on from earlier events in the episode, to become over-encumbered as she's overeaten, and as a result ends up vomiting and leaving her more vulnerable for the moment to come. As a result, when the moment does occur where Kyorya comes to Haruhi's room following on from this entire exchange up until this point, it's not just him showing him physically assaulting Haruhi just for shits and giggles, it's to establish the fact that in the eyes of the club members to this point, despite her projection of her ideals on gender, she's still a girl, and much like Tamaki mentioned prior, is still very much more likely to be taken advantage of compared to the rest of them. Of course, like most things within Ouran, it does serve a greater narrative purpose that Haruhi's entire point on gender norms and identity is the actual take we should be agreeing with in the long term. But for what level of friction it has caused in this moment, it's there more than just for shock value like so many other animes would use this for in the future, make it seem so serious. Hell, one could even argue that this tired staple of using sexual assault was to play on it as a trope for Shojo at the time. Hell, Hana-Kimi wasn't even free of that sin in regards, as that had it pretty early on in its run for dramatic value. But I'd argue on both ends it makes for moments where the dynamics and the relationships between the people that are at odds in regards to it all the better in the long term. But without deviating further into talking about Hana-Kimi when I am focusing on Ouran here, as a lot of people seem to ignore what happens next, where Haruhi basically calls Kyorya on his bluff, trying to use this as a way to establish Tamaki's point on her gender being the one thing that could cause the most issues if left unchecked. This is further elevated for actual drama when Tamaki enters and misunderstands what is happening, causing a fuss between the two of them and later becomes the catalyst for another fight between the two of them, eventually leading to a proper heartfelt moment between Haruhi and Tamaki that further circles around their bond as well as proper romantic interest. While of course having some shenanigans, as this is Ouran of course, it needs to have something to release the tension before the end of the episode or chapter unless things get too serious for its own good.
But that part is only one thing that many current day viewers mostly focus on when talking about Ouran, within its more problematic aspects in that context, and really speaking here, isn't even the main focus on why I'm here talking to you all. So why focus on it so much for something that wasn't related to the queer aspect of Ouran? Simple. It's to establish that Ouran's story narrative does delve into aspects and beats here and there that unfortunately won't age as gracefully as other parts of the same period of time. But it's still worth focusing on as a show of these themes regardless of, by today's standards, it is less progressive than it was back then. It's to establish the complicated nature of this series, for better or worse, of what we're looking at today. More or less. But if you want to talk about more complicated depictions of queerness within Ouran, then here we go. Let's talk about Ranka. If you have heard any level of discourse surrounding Ouran in the last decade, it probably either starts or ends with talking about how Ryuji Fujioka is one of the most outdated portrayals of gender expression in anime amongst its more glaring issues, making problems such as the literal Shota bait and Honey Senpai seem tame by comparison. But the one thing a lot of people seem to get wrong about Ranka is that, by all accounts, he's registered a lot as a joke on how gender expression of the time has been treated, using the fact that Haruhi has mentioned she only has a dad, and then having this sassy piece of work strutted not even a minute later be the comedic punchline to a joke that is obviously outdated by now. Hell, when I mentioned him in passing when talking about Lily with Hunter last year, I especially did mention that as what I viewed Ranka as being in the past as well. But with recent reflections, I feel a need to duly amend that, as while I do agree that the overall sentiment of when it was released and even to now as being that Ryoji is meant as a joke, it doesn't mean he isn't an endearing character at his core or a proper display of queerness shining through within Ouran's story and worthy of being discussed as such for its importance for what we have now.
Ranka's entire MO from the moment of introduction is obviously meant to be a gotcha on Haruhi's end, as she immediately is embarrassed by how her father is conducting himself, acting fully feminine and still in a very obvious outfit. Not to mention the way his voice is presented, the host club immediately taking the piss out of the situation not too long after. But it's in the episode where he's shown for the first time that we do actually get the real centerpiece of the point behind his character. That while he may be a bit of a goofball, and while he may in fact register as more of a caricature more than anything, he is a genuinely caring father to Haruhi. In fact, one of the major reasons that really does tie it all together is how he feels a responsibility to be able to provide as a sole parent for her in the long term. Alongside his own views on gender being a lot more skewy as a result of how he presents himself potentially being part of the reason, even implied at times to be the case, of how Haruhi views herself through the lens of gender. On top of that, at no point in any of Ryoji's arc or discussion is it made as though it was some kind of rash decision to make money, or some joke, or that he does it for the laughs of it. To him, it's just another form of expression of himself, and that while he may refer to himself as an outdated term such as transvestite, he really does genuinely take the role on board with a sense that it's something he wants to do. If anything, Ranka is an empowering display of gender in its finest form. Someone who is able to be confident in their own body and able to gracefully touch the boundaries beyond gender, while also being able to be seen as an influence on those around them. In story at least. In reality, Ranka is very much seen as a character which many people do still have a bit of a complicated relationship with. While I will definitely give her the flower she deserves now more than ever, it needs to be said that yes, Ranka is very much in the camp of deserves to be spoken for more fondly. In fact, most of what Ranka represents is kind of the bold microcosm in some of the bigger things that Ouran helped define for the late 2000s in terms of accepting gender expression more openly in anime, especially within both anime of its time and to now. Because while I've gone and talked about how series like Utena did a lot for queer representation in the past, it needs to be said that anime in the 2000s was basically carrying a torch for what was to come for anime and Japanese media in general to really take off on that front. As while we have talked about some instances of regards to how studios like B-Train were putting yuri relationships into their three big flagship series in Noir, Dot Hack Sign, and Madlax, or how early 2000 shows before then like Gravitation and Kino's Journey helped make more representation of the like more prominent. To have something as widely spanning as a shoujo series, which itself commands a high degree of attention from the masses both of its time, and especially today to be able to display such explicit queerness in its characters, even if it is displayed as a joke at times, is nothing short of important for where we were going to be back in the 2010s. Because if I haven't made it clear since I started working on videos again a few years ago, the only reason we are able to properly appreciate what we have today is only in part due to how firmly we have been able to appreciate shows that do have the representation in the past, like Ouran has been able to provide. And that for every iconic show like Destiny of the Shrine Maiden or Marimite from the era in which I grew up in, you do have to accept that this era does in fact have some very interesting displays of how queerness is shown, and that in order to accept the good queer representation that we have to accept, that there is some more interesting displays of queerness abound that might not be as accepted or as positive. Hell, you want another anime that has some problematic elements? Look no further than the Monogatari series. Suruga is a lesbian that often talks about trying to seduce Aravagi and talks about being his lover a lot throughout her arcs in the show. And while many to this day decry her writing as being a fake lesbian, end of the day, her character arc in the show is fully dependent on her lesbian yearning driving her to commit acts of violence because she's in love with Hitagi. If anything, her way of getting underneath Aragi's skin by constantly calling her his sex slave or lover might be a way for her to play coy and get him back for being with the one she loves. Yet we love Suruga for the relatability when it comes to one-sided crushes like that regardless. Us lesbians love a good twisting of the knife, eh?
And yes, I know that is diverting away from the point of when I am talking about relating to Ouran and going on a classic Chloe tangent. But like, if we can't talk about the parts that may not come across as the best way to display it to the public, then what the fuck is the point about talking about them at all? Because queer representation should be this thing where you have one bit that seems out of line, whoops, we're not allowed to talk about you anymore, like Ouran's assault being used as a character growth moment, or Ranka literally existing in the show. Especially today, we need to accept that some queer representation is going to be messy. It's going to be hard to talk about because of how it is presented, but we shouldn't be afraid of doing so. Because if Ouran was treated as badly by fans both het and queer alike back then as it is being today, God help me, I am not sure we would have such widely showcased avenues of queer representation in modern anime as we are lucky to be able to do so today.
So, well, yes. Ouran's complicated displays of queerness and how it presents itself with its themes is a lot to swallow today for sure. I feel like modern audiences truly take it for granted for what it did for us back when we didn't have a lot of it to go around. And look, this isn't me saying that modern queer anime fans are ungrateful or don't appreciate good anime from my time anymore. I swear to Christ, if you ever catch me acting like a grouchy old bitch on the internet like that in one of these videos, I want to be put out of my misery. Fuck that noise. The point of this is to show appreciation for what came 20 years ago and what it did to help stick with us some years later. Especially when recent anime of the same era has basically shown that some elements of that period are simply timeless and how Hana-Kimi has kept that same energy alive. I mean, for fuck's sake, Hana-Kimi has a blatantly gay man as an antagonistic force at times, attempting to blackmail the girl disguising as a boy at an all-boys school. You gotta admit that energy from the days of Ouran is alive and well here. And it's why, for all its faults and imperfections, we need to appreciate shows and media like Ouran now more than ever. Because asking for every bit of queer representation being this neat, tiny little package for the cishets to lap up and adore for the mainstream media may be nice, but let's be real here, in the long term they're not going to be satisfied. So, I say, more than ever, cherish the series that have stood the test of time like Ouran. Because in an era where we have queer anime literally coming out damn near every season now, it's good to look back on the ones that brought us to the dance in the first place. Even if it's harder and harder to do so as the years roll on. Because a perfect kind of queerness will never exist. Accepting what we have for all of its faults, and then some might argue, is the best way for us to look back on it then, and appreciate it even more now.